The greatness of God. Again, that's the beautiful thing about being a Christian. Regardless of what's going on in your life, there's always something better. There's always something else. There's always that God of comfort that is there. And as we talk about the greatness of God this morning, we're going to be in Isaiah chapter 40. You can be turning there if you would like. Isaiah chapter 40. The book of Isaiah, just to give you some introductory material, it was written in a time of moral and political crisis there in Palestine. God's people were experiencing a lot. It was a time of crisis. It was a very rough time in the lives of God's people. And I think it's so interesting that the book written during this time, written by Isaiah, the name Isaiah actually comes from a Hebrew word meaning the Lord saves. Isn't that interesting? It's as if God is sending a message to His people that even in the midst of a really, really tough time for them, the Lord saves. Isaiah. And so, with all of that in mind, there was a song that was written about 15 years ago entitled, "How Great is Our God." Many of you have probably heard it. I've listened to it on the radio. I listen to it on my phone all the time. It's a great song. And when I think about that song, "How Great is Our God," every time I hear the song, it reminds me of what the psalmist says in Psalm 95 and verse 3, where he says, "For the Lord is a great God, the great King above all gods. In His hands are the depths of the earth." Love the way the psalmist puts it there in Psalm 95 and verse 3. And to be honest with you, though we're looking in Isaiah chapter 40 today, I think we all understand that the greatness of God is something that we could never hope to sum up in one chapter, even if we read all 31 verses, which unfortunately we don't have the time to do. And to be honest with you, I think even having the whole Bible at our fingertips, I don't think a human mind could ever comprehend the greatness of God, because it's so hard to try to understand and comprehend an infinite God when we are finite beings with finite minds. It's hard to wrap your mind around the idea of an omnipotent, omnipresent God. And though that's true, we could never really understand the greatness of God. I think if we were going to try, and we're going to try our best today, I think Isaiah 40 really gives a good description. It gives several reasons, and it shows just why God is so great and what it is that makes Him great. I love the book of Isaiah. And you know, God's people during this time in Isaiah 40, they really needed this description of God, this encouragement. The reason being that from the beginning of the book, Isaiah has been addressing their sinful condition. You see, God's people at this time had began to turn away from Him, and they had turned and taken refuge really in the pagan gods of their pagan neighbors, the nations around them. And from the beginning of the book, actually, if you go back to chapter 1 and verse 4, God says, "Alas, sinful people, a people weighed down with iniquity." So He has been addressing their sin and their disobedience to Him. And He's been telling them there are going to be consequences for your actions. There are going to be consequences for your disobedience to me. But I find it so interesting that even when God is telling them there will be consequence for your action, here in Isaiah chapter 40, He gives them a glimpse of hope. He gives them a moment of hope in this description of the greatness of God. And with all of that in mind, I can't help but think about where we are today. We're in the midst of a pretty trying time, are we not? And I know for so many, they feel like this thing is over, but in all reality, I think we all know that it's not. We know that the effects of all of this going on are going to last for quite some time. Things may never be the same again. But I want you to know that even in the midst of a very, very trying time, that you serve a great God. And in Isaiah 40, there are several things that we want to take note of. And before we even get into the sermon, really digging deep, I'm going to show you just three things, three ways that God's greatness is displayed. But even before I get into the lesson, can you see this picture very well? The beauty of God's creation. Can you not see the greatness of God and the beauty of His creation? You ever sit out at night and you look up at the stars and you look at all the colors and the beauty that's in the sky at night? It's beautiful. And every time I see the heavens, I see space, and I see all of the beautiful things that's going on up there, I can't help but think one thing. Boy, I serve a great God. This is His canvas, if you will. This is the way that He paints a picture for you and I that we get to look at. And it's amazing. And I was watching a movie last night. Sadie and I went and watched it in the movie theaters right before all of this stuff happened. It's called I Still Believe. I don't know if you happen to have seen that or if you've seen previews of that. It's about a Christian music artist by the name of Jeremy Camp, and essentially his rise to becoming famous, but more so than that, it's about his marriage with his first wife that he lost due to ovarian cancer, and how she maintained her faith, and she always had a positive attitude throughout the whole experience. And it's really, really a moving thing to watch, and so I would encourage you to watch that. But there's one scene in particular. It's on their very first date when they're at college, and they go into this, it's like a museum, and they go into this room, and it's like this show that they put on. They shut the door, they turn off all the lights, and they have projected these stars and galaxies and all these things up on the roof that they get to sit and enjoy. And I'll never forget what she says to him as she's explaining what different things are and what different stars are, and explaining galaxies and explaining all of these things. And she was talking about galaxies that are defined by having more than 1 trillion stars in them. And she makes a comment that I really think will stick with me forever. The comment was, the God of 1 trillion stars in a galaxy knows my name. Think about that. The God of 1 trillion stars in a single galaxy knows me by name. He knows how many hairs are on my head. So the greatness of God, I truly believe, first of all, that we can see it in His creation. But the three things that we want to mention, number one, first, the greatness of God is seen in that He is tender. Look with me in Isaiah 40. The greatness of God is seen in that He is tender. And God's tenderness is shown, number one, in that He comforts. Verse 1. It says, "Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God." You know, later on in verse 3 actually is starting a prophecy about John the Baptist. And what I find so interesting is that, again, God has been drilling them, explaining to them the consequences of sin and what God's going to have to do because God is just. But even in the midst of dark times in their life, God is a God who comforts. He's a God who comforts. I find it interesting that He's explaining to them and He's sending a message. I am the God of comfort. I'm here to comfort you now. And there will be a time when the one who is the great comforter, that is Jesus Christ, will come. There will be a forerunner before Him. And He will prepare the way for the one who will bring eternal comfort. The one who will bring comfort to all people for all time is coming. But He's putting the message in their mind that even right now, while He's not here yet, I am the God of comfort. Regardless of what you're doing, what dark times you're experiencing, I want to comfort you. So God's tenderness is seen that He comforts. Secondly, the tenderness of God is seen in that He smooths. In verse 4, it says, "Let every valley be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. And let the rough ground become a plain, and the rugged terrain a broad valley." Boy, the imagery there. I hope that you're getting it. Essentially, what God is saying is that I am a God who smooths. I take the rough and I smooth it out. Boy, life is rough sometimes, is it not? Boy, it's rough. The things that are being thrown at us all the time. And God is sending the same message today, that God's tenderness, His loving kindness is shown in that He smooths. He takes those rough patches and He smooths it out. And that's what He's telling His people in this time. He's saying, I will smooth out the rough times and I will create a valley from the rough. So God's tenderness is shown in that He comforts. It's shown in that He smooths, and it's also shown in that, number 3, He gives good news. Verse 9. It says, get yourself up on a high mountain, O Zion, bearer of good news. Lift up your voice mightily, O Jerusalem, bearer of good news. Lift it up. Do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. Man, it's amazing. Again, the bad news is sin has consequences, and He's been drilling this into the minds of His people. But the good news, He says, I am the Lord. I am your God. You know, that's the amazing thing about being a child of God today. That's the amazing thing about the greatness of God. When we find ourselves in situations like the people of God find themselves in Isaiah chapter 40, when we're so covered and we're so entangled in iniquity and we're so entangled in our sin and we're making all the bad decisions and we just can't seem to escape, there is one who gives you good news. The application is this. You and I have the ultimate good news. That is that a man loved you so much that He went to the cross and He died for you, as we've been singing about this morning. And that good news is far too good to be kept inside the walls of the church building, is it not? That is the good news that we want everyone to know. Hey, I know you've made all the bad decisions in life, it seems. I know that you haven't been faithful, but here's the good news. There was a man who went to the cross so that all the bad things that you've done, all the bad decisions that you've made can be wiped clean if you will only submit to Him, be obedient to Him, and follow in His commandments. Be immersed into Christ Jesus and live a faithful life. That's good news, folks. We don't need to be keeping that to ourselves. And we see the greatness of God in His tenderness. And the tenderness of God is seen in that He is a God who loves to give His people good news. Don't you love getting good news? Love it. When you get good news, it just makes your day. The tenderness of God is shown, fourthly, in that He rewards. In verse 10. It says, behold, the Lord will come with might, with His arm ruling for Him. Behold, His reward is with Him, and His recompense before Him. You know, the Bible is very clear in that God is a God who loves to reward obedience. Isn't that amazing too? When you think about all of our disobedience, and the fact that God is looking forward to a time when He gets to reward us is baffling. We just got through singing, why should I gain from His reward? I cannot give an answer. And that's my response, is I can't give an answer. Chase, why does God reward us? I really don't know. We've done nothing to deserve God's faithfulness. We've really done nothing to deserve God's reward. But God says, I want to give it to you anyway. And because of that and in the way that He rewards a disobedient people, we see the God of tenderness. The Bible is very clear that God is going to reward those who are obedient to Him. Matthew chapter 16 and verse 27, Romans chapter 2 and verse 6, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10, Revelation chapter 20 and verse 12, all over the Bible. It explains that God is going to come and He is going to reward those who are faithful to Him. So His tenderness is shown, fourthly, in that He rewards. It's shown, fifthly, in that He shepherds. He shepherds. Verse 11. It says, like a shepherd, He will tend His flock. In His arm He will gather the lambs and carry them in His bosom. He will gently lead the nursing ewes. Yeah, it's so beautiful. You want to know what one of my biggest pet peeves is? Some of you just said, oh no, here we go. You want to know what one of my biggest pet peeves is when it comes to the Bible, when it comes to being a child of God? Is when people talk about the God of the Old Testament, and they talk about how God wasn't even the same God in the Old Testament as He is in the New Testament. like the God of the New Testament is in the God of the Old Testament. They're just so different because that God of the Old Testament was angry. He was mad. He loved to destroy things and destroy cities and destroy people. And he was just mad all the time. Does that bother you as much as it bothers me? That people talk about our God that way? They say he was mad and he was angry and he was just and he was all of these things in the Old Testament. And boy, I'm sure glad he changed his mind in the New Testament. That's not true. That's not true at all. As a matter of fact, when I think about this, I go back to Genesis chapter 3. We know what happens in Genesis chapter 3. The fall of man happens, right? Adam and Eve, they sin. They bring about the first sin in the land, and people are so quick to point out the fact that God kicked them out of the garden and there was punishment. Sure there was. God is just. God is going to punish disobedience, but what no one ever points out is the fact that God seeks them. Did anybody ever talk about that? That God goes to them. He seeks them. He wants to hear from them. Why does no one ever talk about that part? And everyone always talking about this quote-unquote God of the Old Testament. Folks, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are one and the same. Our God never changes. Our God is the same today, yesterday, forevermore. God has never changed. Here, Isaiah, Old Testament book, major prophet. And this is what God says. He says, like a shepherd, I'm going to tend my flock. You know, you and I are a part of that flock. What does a shepherd do? And when we think back to what a shepherd did at this time, during the time of the Old Testament, during the time that this book was written, obviously it was the shepherd's job to make sure that the flock had everything they needed to be successful, right? What is your job as a cattle rancher? I know there's plenty of those in the room. What's your job? Your job is to make sure that your flock, your herd, has everything that they need in order to be successful. To look the best, okay? And to bring the best when you take your calves in. It's your job to make sure that your herd has everything they need. You feed, you put out hay, you put out mineral, you put out all these things, you doctor, you worm, vaccinate, you do all of these different things to cattle because you want to make sure they succeed. In the same way, a shepherd, that's the way he takes care of the flock. He sees to it that they have everything that they need because he understands that the flock is incapable of seeing to its own needs. We're the flock because we're incapable of seeing to our own needs. And the beautiful thing, it says that like a shepherd, he will tend his flock. In his arms, he will gather the lambs and carry them in his bosom. He will gently lead the nursing ewes. God is tender. God has always been tender. Even in the Old Testament, don't let anyone try to feed you this stuff that God was not, that he was angry and he was mad. Well, God was definitely just. He had every reason for being so because of the disobedience of his people. But because man just could not follow that old law, Paul talks about the relationship between grace and law in the book of Galatians. I would encourage you to read that sometime. And Paul explains that it's because of the sinfulness of man, because of man's iniquity and his inability to follow the old law, because the old law was a law that was based on works. It was based on earning your salvation, earning your way to heaven. And because people were unable to keep that law, we had to have a new law. God sent his son Jesus to die for us. In what world is that an angry God? So God is tender. His greatness is seen in that he's tender. His tenderness is seen as that in that he comforts, he smooths, he gives good news, he rewards, and he shepherds. The greatness of God is seen in another way. Second, number 2, God's tenderness is shown in that he is transcendent. Well, there's a big one right here. The greatness of God is seen in that he is transcendent. You know, God is not bound by our human limitations. There are certain things that we as human beings just aren't physically capable of doing. And God is not bound by those same limitations. He's not bound by our rules, for he is the rule maker. He is perfect. He is transcendent. Verses 12 through 27. First, his transcendence is seen in that he has an infinite presence. That is, he is omnipresent. In verse 12, chapter 40. It says, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the heavens by the span and calculated the dust of the earth by the measure and weighed the mountains in a balance and the hills in a pair of scales. He has an infinite presence. I'm a statistics kind of person. I love it. I think it's sports that did that to me, but I love statistics. Here's some things, some statistics I want to share with you. There are about 326 million trillion gallons of water on the earth today. 326 million trillion gallons of water in the earth today. Of that 326 million trillion, only about 3% is fresh water. And of that 3% that is fresh water, about 2/3 of that is locked up in glaciers and ice caps and things of that nature. Well, so what? Here's a so what. That means that our great God is able to take that remaining 1% of all of the water in the world and sustain life for nearly 8 billion people. Isn't that amazing? 1% of all the supply of water on the face of the earth, and God is able to sustain life for over almost 8 billion people. That's amazing. It says also here in verse 12 that He who has marked off the heavens by the span. You know what a span is? That's the distance from about the end of your shoulder to the end of your fingertip. That's a span. And it says that God measures the universe by a span. In other words, the distance from the end of his shoulder to the edge of his fingertips. And God measures the universe. Do you have any idea how big the universe is? Well, I have some numbers. I would like to think that they're accurate. Who knows? Scientists estimate that the universe is about 92 billion light years in diameter. 92 billion light years in diameter. And it says that God measures that distance from his shoulder down to his fingertips. How great is your God? It says also in verse 12 that he calculates the dust of the earth by the measure and he weighs the mountains in a balance. That is to say that God can measure the weight of the world. You know how big the world probably is? How much it weighs? Well, we estimate that it weighs about 6.6 sextillion metric tons. That's a pretty big number. 6.6 sextillion metric tons. It's about how much the earth weighs. And it says that God is able to hold that, to weigh that. How great is your God? It takes a pretty big God to do something like that. I may have shared this with you before, but in the last few decades, they've discovered a star that they estimate to be about 3 trillion times the size of our sun. About 3 trillion times the size of our sun is this star. It takes a pretty good big God to spit that thing out, does it not? Any God that could speak all of that into existence, that's a pretty great God. That's amazing. God has an infinite presence. God is able to be everywhere at once. He is everywhere at once because He's great. God's transcendence is seen, secondly, in that He has infinite knowledge. Verse 13. It says, who has directed the Spirit of the Lord? Or as His counselor has informed Him, with whom did He consult and who gave Him understanding? And who taught Him in the path of justice and taught Him knowledge and informed Him of the way of understanding? In other words, we can't teach God anything because God knows everything. He has an infinite presence and He has an infinite knowledge. Well, how much does our God know? Well, He knows what we need before we ask Him. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 8, that's pretty amazing. The Lord your God knows what you need long before you ever ask Him. The Lord God knows what's inside of every man. John chapter 2 and verse 25. That's amazing. Nearly 8 billion people in the world, and God knows the thoughts. God knows what's inside of every single one of those 8 billion people. That's a pretty great God. He has infinite knowledge in His transcendence, and His transcendence is also seen, thirdly, in that he has infinite power. Verses 15 through 26. It says, "Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are regarded as a speck of dust on the scales. Behold, he lifts up the islands like fine dust. Even Lebanon is not enough to burn, nor its beasts enough for a burnt offering. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are regarded by him as less than nothing and meaningless. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare with him? As for the idol, a craftsman casts it. A goldsmith plates it with gold, and a silversmith fashions chains of silver. He who is too impoverished for such an offering selects a tree that does not rot. He seeks out for himself a skillful craftsman to prepare an idol that will not totter. Do you know him? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. He it is who reduces rulers to nothing, who makes the judges of the earth meaningless. Scarcely have they been planted, scarcely have they been sown, scarcely has their stock taken root in the earth, but he merely blows on them and they wither, and the storm carries them away like stubble. To whom then will you liken me, that I would be his equal, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these stars, the one who leads forth their host by number. He calls them all by name. Because of the greatness of his might and the strength of his power, not one of them is missing. Well, that's powerful. How great is your God? Well, your God has infinite power. All the power far beyond what we could ever imagine. He is more powerful than the nations of men, verses 15 through 17. He is more powerful than the other gods, verses 18 through 20. He is more powerful than the earth, it says in verse 22. He is more powerful than the rulers of the earth, verses 23 and 24. And he is more powerful than the universe, verses 25 and 26. I ask again, how great is your God? God is transcendent in that he has an infinite presence. He is everywhere. He has an infinite knowledge. He knows everything. And he has infinite power in that he has all the power to do anything that he wants. More power than we could ever imagine. So question, what does that mean for you and I right now in the year 2020? Well, it means that God is more powerful than anything in the world right now, including COVID-19. It means that God is more powerful than any struggle. It means that God is more powerful than any who tries to sway you to abandon your faith. It means that God is Lord over all. That he is so great. So the greatness of God is seen in that he is tender. It's seen in that he is transcendent. Thirdly and finally, God's greatness is seen in that he is tireless. Verses 28 through 31. I think most of us know what Isaiah 40:31 says, right? We're going to get there. We're going to get there. Be patient with me. I know you've all been probably thinking about that one verse the whole sermon. We'll get there. But God's greatness is seen in that he is tireless. Boy, this one really hits home with me. It seems like I'm tired all the time. I came up and played basketball for a couple hours last night, and I can't even explain to you. I had to sit down for about 45 minutes to catch my breath. I was tired. I'm not in as good a shape as I once was. This one blows my mind. The fact that God is tireless. You know, there was a runner from New Zealand by the name of Kim Allen. And she set out to break the world record for most consecutive time spent running without stopping. Kim Allen ran for 86 consecutive hours without stopping. She traveled over 310 miles before she stopped to catch her breath. Isn't that amazing? 86 consecutive hours she ran without rest, 310 miles. That's baffling. Then there was also a guy by the name of Randy Gardner. And Randy Gardner set out to break the world record for most consecutive time spent without sleeping. He made it over 11 days without sleeping. 11 days. That's amazing. Can you imagine trying to do either one of those? But here's the cool thing about it. 86 hours, 310 miles. That's the best that we can do as human beings. The very best. That's the world record. 11 days without sleeping. That is the very best man has ever been able to do. Yet your God never tires. Your God never needs to take a break. He is great in that He is tireless. First of all, number one, His tirelessness is seen in that He never grows weary or tired, according to verse 28. It says, "Do you not know? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, does not become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable. He gives strength to the weary, and to him who lacks, He increases power." I'll get there again here in a minute. God never grows weary or tired, according to verse 28. Isn't that amazing? Though those two accomplishments we just mentioned were amazing at the end of it, I can tell you what they probably went and did. Probably had to go lay down someplace and rest a while. I don't know. I would have probably slept for weeks if I had to do something like that. But your God is tireless. He never grows tired. But I have something for you even cooler than that, and we're going to end on this point. Even cooler than the fact that God never grows weary and He never grows tired. He never needs to rest. Last point. God not only never grows weary or tired, but He gives strength to those that do. Verses 29 through 31. It says, "He gives strength to the weary. And to him who lacks might, He increases power. Though youths grow weary and tired, and vigorous young men stumble badly, yet those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary." Isn't that something? The God that you serve today is so great. And His greatness is seen in that He is tender to a disobedient people. His greatness is seen in that He is transcendent. And His greatness is seen in that He is tireless. How great is our God? I'm sure glad that you're here today. I'm glad that you're here to worship God, to tell Him how much you love Him. We're going to offer up a song of invitation. We want to help you. We really want you to know that. We want to pray with you. We want to pray for you. If it's something you don't want necessarily everyone to know, come see me afterwards. Come see someone in the leadership afterwards. We'd love to talk with you. If it's your desire to become a child of God today and be baptized, we'd love to help you with that. Whatever your need, we want to help you. Don't forget it. Whatever your need, please come as we stand.